It's a real pleasure to welcome Professor Daniel Byman to Dartmouth and to the Dickey Center. Dan is a good friend of many years and a former colleague of mine from Washington. And for that reason, I'm thrilled he's here. I'm also delighted because he's a rarity in the world of scholarship. He has achieved in scholarship, as most people want to, in music, crossover status. He does hard work published in refereed journals and esteemed by his colleagues, many of whom are here today. And he also can explain arcane subjects for a broader public in a very effective and fluent way. And you will see his writing in many, many different places. And if you see it, you should read it because he usually has the best take on whatever issue it is he addresses. Dan and I go way back, as I said, and we have also had the curious fate of getting lots of each other's email for fairly obvious reasons having to do with our names. So I know more about Dan than perhaps I should for the ordinary speaker. But I can tell you a few things that are publicly known. He is a professor in the Security Studies program in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and he has a concurrent appointment in the Department of Government at Georgetown. Additionally, he is a senior fellow and director of research at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. I first met Dan when he was a member of the staff of the Congressional Joint Inquiry into 9/11, when I guess he was one of my very first interrogators. It was not a coercive interrogation. There were no enhanced methods that were used. And then he moved on to work on the 9/11 Commission, which was the Blue Ribbon Commission to end all commissions, and he did a great job there. He has also worked at RAND, and he has been consulted with the U.S. government on many different occasions. He's written on a wide range of different issues. His most recent book is A High Price, The Triumph and Failures of Israeli Counterterrorism, which got superb reviews, and deservedly so. He's also written on the global jihad, on state sponsorship of terrorism, and on ethnic conflict, and many, many other issues. I'm delighted that he's come to talk about this vexatious issue of drones and warfare and modern technologies and the fight against terror. Because he can talk about these issues in a way that I can't, and because I know he'll do so with great sense and insight. Thank you very much, Dan, for being here.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, the other Dan, for that very kind introduction. I'm going to talk today about drones. The use of drones as a counterterrorism instrument has been in place really for over a decade. But it's not since the last year, and perhaps even the last few months, that it's generated tremendous attention and indeed controversy. Some of this debate, to me at least, is quite confusing. Drones are often used as shorthand, where people who are critical of US airstrikes in general talk about drones, but they're at times really mean strikes by traditional aircraft, F-15s, F-16s. At other times, there's criticism of drones, and what people are really talking about is our policy of killing wanted terrorists. And so whether they're killed by a drone or by a bullet, it's really the policy, not the mechanism. And at times, and related, it's about a question of civilian casualties. And what I'm going to talk today is about in my view at least, the advantages of using drones and the advantages of these policies, and then go through various objections. And as you'll see, I come out as kind of a supporter of the drone program, but with a few caveats. And I think some of the objections are actually quite well taken. But on balance, in my view at least again, don't hold. As Ambassador Benjamin mentioned, we met during some of my investigations into 9/11. And that was what first really interested me in the drone program on the American side. In the 1990s, the United States was actively trying to target Osama bin Laden. And there were CIA efforts. But these were primarily attempts to arrest bin Laden. And this was extremely difficult. To capture him, you'd have to send in a squad. And he had bodyguards. You'd be sending him into a dangerous part of Afghanistan. You'd have to get them in and out. And even if you could find him, even if you could do the operation, it was deemed in general far, far too dangerous and extremely hard. There was a concurrent effort done by the US military, which was to kill him, but to do so primarily with airstrikes, especially cruise missiles. Cruise missiles, for those of you who are not fans of technology or know it too well, are actually rather slow. So if you launch a cruise missile from several hundred kilometers away, it takes a while to get there. For killing someone, that has big implications. Because let us say that, understandably, people want to kill Dan Byman. And you all report that he is giving a talk right now at the Dickey Center. Right? If it takes several hours for the missile to arrive, the question is not where is Dan Byman? It's where will Dan Byman be in several hours? And as a result, if your goal is to kill him, if your goal is to kill him without killing lots of civilians, it's actually quite hard to know that futuristic question. And much of this was moot because it was extremely hard to find bin Laden in the first place. Right? So where he was extremely hard, let alone where would he be. All these things, the difficulty of capture, the question of where someone will be, who's with them, drones can solve these. Right? Because if the drone is right above us, it knows where I am. It can skip the messiness of capture. It knows where I will be. It knows who's around me. And you can launch a strike with a lot more certainty of killing the right person at the right time with fewer casualties. So with this in mind, drones really took off, especially under the Obama administration. The Bush administration, perhaps to the surprise of many, used drones quite sparingly. Up to 2007, really only a handful of drone strikes. And then it starts to take off in the last year of President Bush in 2008, where there were fewer than 40 strikes, but it really is a substantial increase. And then under Obama, it goes on steroids. Right? So in 2010, you have over 120 attacks. And it expands beyond the Pakistan-Afghan area and starts to go into Yemen in particular in recent years. So you see a much more massive campaign being waged. And in some ways, this is kind of the counterterrorism weapon of choice for many in the Obama administration. And so let me lay out the pros from a counterterrorism point of view. Let's start with the obvious. It kills people, right? And if your goal is to stop terrorists, one way to stop them is to kill them. And this is especially important if you're talking about relatively senior leaders or relatively skilled leaders. Right? So leaders whose loss means that the organization cannot easily replace them. And in part, there's an inevitable confusion that comes when someone in an organization is removed. Someone has to replace them, right? Right now, we are looking, and forgive the comparison, but we're all watching as white smoke is about to appear at the Vatican. And the question is, who's going to replace this leader, right? And this is something that is bringing church operations in a lot of important issues to a halt, right? The church still goes on in a variety of ways, but a lot of key decisions are punted aside as people wait for who a new leader is, right? With the drone strikes, you have this issue of individuals are gone, and then add to it at a rapid pace. So what's different about, and there's some academic literature that addresses drones, in my view, in a very, I'll say, wrong way in some ways. What's different about what we are doing, it's more akin to what Israel did in the early part of the last decade, is it's a drone campaign. So not only are you killing leaders, you're killing them on a regular basis. So a new person comes in and they're killed too. And as a result, there's constant churn within the organization. New leaders rise up, but they're not as good as the old ones because they haven't been in the job as long. They haven't been vetted as long. They're not as skilled as long. Shortly after bin Laden was killed, the new number 2 of the organization, a man named Atiyah, we have letters from him where he's complaining about the impact that the drone campaign is taking on al-Qaeda. And he's saying, this is really an issue for us, and that our leaders are being killed faster than they can be replaced. And this is a huge point, right? This is a huge question in counterterrorism is, are you able to break into that cycle? And here we have the best evidence you could want, right? A senior al-Qaeda figure saying this internally. He, by the way, is then killed with a drone. And so you have this cycle that is devastating to the organization. Drones also enable reach, right? You can go into places you couldn't otherwise go. Now, fixed-wing aircraft can go there too. But drones are able to loiter above a target for a considerable amount of time. And as a result, do attacks that would be even harder in some ways than using fixed-wing aircraft because of the loiter capability. In relative terms, drones are also cheap. Right? Now, cost I got off the very reputable Wikipedia source was that a Predator drone is about $4 million, right? And the marginal cost of an F-22 is worth about 40 drones, right? And that's, in my view, understates it in many ways. But there are some things about drones. They require a large human apparatus to support them. You need other assets. But in general, a relatively cheap asset, right? And in terms of having a sustainable defense posture, having assets that are relatively cheap is extremely important. Very important. The pilot is going to survive, right? So one huge issue that came up in the 1990s is, what if we're running a plane over Afghanistan and they shoot it down, right? They have a hostage, we've done an act of war, oh my God, the complications, on and on. A US drone, unarmed, crashed over Iran. It's a bit embarrassing, but the pilot survived, right? There's no espionage trial, there's no high-profile American serviceman, there's no Gary Francis Powers sort of situation going on. And from a policy point of view, that's a huge advantage, is the cost, the human cost, is much lower. And also, the drones were designed in part to use very small munitions compared to fixed-wing aircraft. And as a result, there's less what the horrible jargon is collateral damage, right? There's less unwanted damage to human beings and to property. And when you compare it to a cruise missile, when you compare it to, say, a 1,000-pound bomb, this is a much more precise means of targeting. And again, I'll go back to, you'll know where the target will be. So it's not just that you're launching an attack, it's you're launching an attack having some degree of situational awareness of what's going to happen when the bomb hits. There's one big impact, though, of drones that most people don't think of, which is there are ways to avoid drones, right? If you're a terrorist, one thing you try to minimize is communication. The United States government tracks the communications of its adversaries, right? So you try to avoid cell phones, right? There was a meeting in Europe where a jihadist leader picked up his phone and said, this is the weapon of Satan, right? And why? Because these can be used to track individuals. You avoid meeting in large groups. You don't do things where you have lots and lots of people cluster in one place. All these things do help you avoid drones. And there was a tip sheet that just came out of Mali where some of the individuals there gave a tip sheet on how to avoid drone attacks. It was actually quite helpful, I thought. If you look at this tip sheet, and if you look at what you have to do to avoid it, it makes it far harder to run a terrorist organization, right? Imagine running a company, okay? Not a large-scale, underground, dangerous, violent organization, but something much simpler. Say, oh, by the way, don't use your phone, don't use your computer, and don't meet in large groups, and make sure you are related to anyone you're going to talk to because they might be a spy otherwise, right? That's a huge cost. So the adaptation cost to avoid drones or minimize drones is staggering. And as a result, pre-9/11, groups like Al-Qaeda spent most of their time on offense, right? They were planning attacks because they had a degree of haven and a degree of safety. Post 9/11, for a variety of reasons, not just drones, they're playing defense. And as a result, the amount of time they can spend doing large-scale, sophisticated attacks is greatly reduced. Okay, in my view at least, those are the pros. Let's look at the cons. Con number one, drones kill innocent people. They do. Okay, let's say that clearly, they do. There is a fairly exhaustive process for trying to make sure, A, that the people on the kill list deserve to be on the kill list, and B, that there is proportionality and an attempt to avoid civilian casualties. Okay, so there's a fairly exhaustive process, but it's far from perfect. I will say anytime you are talking about dropping things that explode on a regular basis, you're going to have casualties, right? I mean, this is part of warfare, and it would be odd to not have mistakes when this happens. There is a huge debate about the number of actual non-combatant deaths. Groups like the New America Foundation, which is a relatively liberal think tank, put the number actually quite low. Right? The US government has at times claimed, in my view, staggeringly and somewhat misleadingly, low civilian figures as well. Critics will claim that there are hundreds, if not more, of innocent casualties as a result of these strikes. It's very hard to tell the truth for a couple reasons. One is a very big question of what constitutes a militant. Right? Clearly, someone who is, I would say, who is a member of Al-Qaeda, who is actively planning an operation, is part of a militant, is a militant under in my view, a fairly straightforward definition. But what about kind of young men with rifles going back and forth to Afghanistan from Pakistan? Right? And there are debates on this, right? If this is an armed culture, right? There are a lot of young men with rifles. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest where young men with rifles were not members of terrorist groups, right? They were people who you hung out with on Friday night. And so there was a question on whom to count. And there's been a shift in US targeting from what the initial jargon was personality strikes, where known individuals who you had a bio, you had some sense of who they are, where they were in an organization, to what's called signature strikes, where you're looking at profiles of individuals. An example might be going back and forth across the Afghan-Pakistan border with a lot of weapons, right? And you say, that's probably nasty behavior. I think they're involved in militant activity, and therefore they fit a certain type of profile that's legitimate for targeting. There's actually been a tremendous number of high-level figures killed via signature strikes. That in some ways this has been a more effective way of hitting the high-level folks because often the precise intel was lacking on who exactly where these people were, where they were, but they were picked up by being part of a broader signature. There was an assumption, however, on US casualty figures, which was that basically dead young men were assumed to be guilty, right? So if a young man died a young man of fighting age died in a strike, whether drone or otherwise, he was assumed to be a combatant. And that's a pretty big jump. But the attempt as part of the signature strikes was to try to define certain activities that counted for this. So this leads to a second, I would say, disadvantage, which is that drones reportedly anger allied governments. Okay, and here I think we have to be kind of sort out some of the smoke from reality. We have repeated protests, especially from Pakistan, about the drone campaign. There was a recent directive to the Pakistani military to shoot down US planes and drones over Pakistan. However, there have been some very interesting things according to press leaks, excuse me. One is that, oh, by the way, the drones are flown from bases in Pakistan, right? So this is something done with the full knowledge and backing of the Pakistani government. Also, that there are deals back and forth between the United States and these governments about the nature of the campaign, who will be hit, and so on. I personally have no inside knowledge of this, but the press reporting seems to fit a very two-faced approach of the Pakistani government towards our counterterrorism policy. Yemen. We have reports from in the past on Yemen where they said, you kill these guys and we'll pretend it's our Air Force, right? And by the way, we'll protest in public if there's a problem. So there's definitely a two-faced approach by allies, and this is something to remember. We only use drone attacks, or these attacks in general, with friends. Okay? These are things we do with allies. We are acting both for our interests and for the counterinsurgency interests of our allies, whether it's Yemen, Pakistan, or elsewhere. We don't drone enemies. Okay? So Iran, there is an al-Qaeda presence in Iran, at times a number of fairly senior figures. We haven't done drone attacks there. It would be a massive escalation if we did drone attacks there. It would be, many people consider it an act of war. It could have a whole host of really dangerous consequences. So ironically, we're using this force that is criticized by allies on behalf of allies. So the allied government hates it to me thing is actually not a very fair comparison. Third criticism, though, which is that the allied publics hate them. There have been some studies, in my opinion, rather flawed ones, about this issue. There was one that came out recently that was based on a bunch of interviews with people in Pakistan that talked about a very high level of civilian deaths. It talked about how unpopular these were. Oh, by the way, the interviews were arranged by an anti-drone NGO within Pakistan. There's a fair number based on press reports in Pakistan. Oh, by the way, Pakistani intelligence feeds these press reports. So this doesn't mean that what they're saying is false, but to me it should raise a lot of questions about how our knowledge base and what we know about them. These studies about the criticism of drones also miss the overall unpopularity of the United States in these regions, right? If you look at, I don't know any of your voting preferences and so on, but you know, I'm trying to remember the exact figures, but the number of Americans who voted for neither for Governor Romney or President Obama in the last election was incredibly small as a percentage of the overall population. Okay? That's the percentage of Pakistanis who have a favorable opinion of the United States, right? So, seriously, that matches, right? And so if the question is, do you think the United States is doing X, is it a good idea? Almost no matter what it is, it's bad, right? You know, Hitler is trying to help babies. Well, I'm not sure about that. It's probably a bad thing, right? Why? Because it's Hitler, right? The United States is deeply unpopular. And so things like a polio campaign are wildly unpopular in parts of Pakistan, right? An anti-polio campaign because of the tremendous suspicion of the United States and of the West in general. So not surprisingly, drone strikes are unpopular, but it's really the United States that's unpopular for a whole variety of reasons. And some of the polls that I've done have shown there's actually more opposition to the drone campaign in areas farther away from where the bombs are being dropped, right? So it's in more areas, urban areas, nationalistic areas, rather than the individuals who are dealing with the drones because they hate the militants, right? The militants are a plague upon their areas, and they're happy to see them dead. Now, having said all that, there should be some cautions. Even though data are bad, we should recognize that, in general, dropping bombs on an area is not likely to be popular, right? And especially if there are some non-combatant deaths, which I think are likely. And further, if some of the combatants are kind of young men caught up in what they feel is a local war rather than arch terrorists who have been, you know, around the block 20 times, right? And so it's highly likely to me this is an unpopular campaign. I'm not sure the degree of it and how much we know that. David Kilcullen, who is in some ways the ultimate scholar practitioner of counterinsurgency, very senior, serious academic who's been involved in a variety of counterinsurgency efforts with the US government, and he's originally Australian. He talks about counterinsurgency math, right? Where if, in a normal military campaign, if you're being charged by a squad of 10 guys and you kill 2 of them, you have 8 left to deal with, right? In a counterinsurgency campaign, if the same thing happens, you kill 2 of them, maybe you have 20 to deal with because those 2 have cousins and brothers and tribesmen who join the fight, right? So you can make things worse by killing people. There's a different view, though, among many people. And I'll call this the Israeli view, in part because a lot of my own research was on Israel, which is that there's a bottom to the barrel, right? So if you kill enough, they're not replaced. And if you kill the right people, they're not replaced by the same quality of person, right? So if, let us say there was a senior bomb maker who is killed. I might be asked, if I were a member of a militant group, to replace that person. But I don't know how to make a bomb, right? So sure, it's 1 for 1, but there's a huge loss in organizational capacity. So the question in some ways is who's coming into the replacements. That said, this probably does weaken the legitimacy of allied governments, right? This is something that's unpopular. The United States is playing a role in defending another country, its own security, which is almost inherently unpopular in most countries. That said, if you look at Yemen, if you look at Pakistan, I would say they have about a dozen very big, serious problems, ranging from the fundamental corruption of their political system to large-scale insurgencies on their soil, to economic decline, to environmental degradation, to you name it, they got it. The US drone campaign might be somewhere on the list of why people are unhappy with their government. I don't think it's very high on the list. And I think in general, it might be used as a pretext for deeper, broader concerns. It could be a straw that breaks the camel's back in some of these cases, but I again think the problems are much deeper. There's a fourth criticism. Drones are too easy, and they replace policy. Because it's so easy to fly a drone over another country, you don't risk your own people's security, it doesn't cost much. You can do it very easily, and as a result, you can use force very easily. It means intervention, which should be of grave concern, is treated as a very casual measure. And in general, the American public does not need to be engaged, right? You could have a massive drone effort, and it's really only a bunch of kind of wired people in Florida that are concerned about this rather than the overall public. I think this, again, is a bit exaggerated. first of all, there are going to be limits to this. In the vast majority of cases, the United States prefers to arrest rather than kill suspected terrorists. There's a certain degree of morality to this and legitimacy as part of this, but also in terms of efficacy, there's a desire to interrogate these people for intelligence purposes. That's why you want to find out, who they are, and if they're dead, they can't talk. What that means in practice is that in the vast majority of the world, the way you handle the problem is you call up the local government and ask for help. So we're not going to be doing drone attacks in a variety of places. We're not going to do them in France, say, right? Why? Because you call up the French government. You're not going to do them in Jordan. You call up the Jordanian government. It's only in places where the government is too weak to help that these are considered. So if you look at where people have seen these, right? Yemen, Pakistan, people talk of Mali, people talk of Somalia. These are places where you can't rely on the government. So there's an inherent limit to where they'll be done. Again, we'll be working with allies, even in these countries. There's something that, to be honest, I haven't kind of wrapped my own mind around in terms of what I think. Drone attacks are also a way for politicians to do something, right? And that's usually seen, especially in the academic community and the analytic community, as a negative, right? Those politicians want to show they're acting tough or being tough or doing something. In my view, that's actually not always a bad thing, right? The American people want their government to be doing something. We want our president to be doing something about unemployment. We would be upset if President Obama had said 4 years ago, I'm just going to wait for the business cycle to change. And eventually it will, and employment will be on the rebound, right? We'd be appalled our president was so callous, even though most economists would say that's a much more realistic approach to having a fundamental change in employment than the minor changes in government policy that were being considered. We want our leaders to do something. And as a result, drones are one of those things they can do fairly dramatically at relatively low cost. I would also add that, in general, I think it's good to have lots of intervention options, ranging from very high end to very low end. And things that enable lower cost intervention is something that at least should be available to a president rather than taken off the table. There's a fifth criticism, which is the use of drones against American citizens, right? And this is the al-Awlaki killing in Yemen. This is a bit misleading because it's not really about the drone. It's about killing an American citizen, right? I think the criticism would be similar if someone had shot him with a rifle. So it's not about the platform per se. A few things here. One is, in political science jargon, we would say the n equals 1, right? This has happened once, right? So we're talking so far a singular case rather than, I would say, a comprehensive policy. If I was going to pick an individual American citizen to kill, this guy would be pretty high on my list. He was extremely effective. The only major attack on US soil since 9/11, successful one, were the Fort Hood killings. And he seemed to have played a major role in radicalizing the killer there. And in part because of his American citizenship. He was someone who knew the American idiom, who could speak to Americans. He was an extremely good propagandist, which is not, I will stress, why he was targeted. But nevertheless, that was a very important role. From Yemen, he was involved in operations on a relatively continuous basis, including a couple near misses that almost downed US aircraft, as well as some operations in the United Kingdom. So someone steadily involved in a range of effective operations, some quite sophisticated. Now, there are some counters to this, right? One is, well, he's an American citizen who was killed without trial, which is true. Also, it's a very heavy assertion of presidential power, right? That the president can simply say, let it be done, and apparently it was done. And there's another, which is that there was no imminent threat, that this was not a man who was about to himself fire a weapon, launch a bomb, right? There was, this happened at a time when he was actually not in motion to do an attack. I think these criticisms are overstated. First of all, it's important to recognize what the Obama administration is not claiming. If you look at the legal opinions that have come out in the press, they're not claiming they can target any American citizen. Right? They're claiming they can target someone who is a senior leader of Al-Qaeda or an associated movement. Right? So presumably that's a very, very small number of American citizens, if not close to zero. Right? So that's a very narrow claim in some ways. They're also saying that if they can capture someone, they don't have the authority to kill them, right? That they will turn towards capture first. And so again, if the individual is in France, if the individual is in the United States, they would be pursuing a different option. I'm not a lawyer, so I have to be careful what I'm talking to you about because it might give you the illusion of expertise where is particularly lacking. There's a question of the term imminence, right? And imminence in a normal English language sense means that something's almost immediately about to happen. That actually is not the legal definition that the Obama administration has interpreted. Right? What they're saying is that there may be an individual who is involved in a steady series of attacks. And you can't know when the next one's going to go off because intelligence is not perfect. Right? A number of the attacks al-Awlaki did were not predicted or anticipated by intelligence. So what is imminent is his continually planning is the imminent part. When the operation will go off or not, you don't know. And so if that's where they're focusing the imminence definition, which is a little different than, I would say, an intuitive sense of that word. They're also invoking a state of war. Right? And this is something that Congress has approved, the courts have supported, and done so recently. Right? So they're doing this with the full support of Congress and the courts. You may disagree that we are in a state of war over this, but it's something that is accepted across the branches of your government, right? And all three of them. And lethal force, including lethal force against one's own citizens, is acceptable in war. There were Americans who fought on the German side in World War II, for example. It's also a due process question, right? The administration has said there was a lot of vetting that went into this decision. And this was legal vetting, it involved multiple bureaucracies. This constitutes due process, just not in the sense we think of in the court, in a sense of due process for a criminal involved in our judicial system. You may disagree with that, but that's the argument they're making. There are a couple troubles, of course. If the United States is in a war, when does this war end? Right? This war has presumably been going on since 9/11. And what does it mean for the war to end? Does it mean terrorism ends forever? I don't know. Right? I mean, to me, the state of war question is very, very open-ended. And also, the administration has made this worse because they haven't released a lot of the details on the legal findings. So my statements on imminence are based on some of the stuff that's been released and by statements by rather thoughtful legal scholars who are sympathetic to the administration's position. I could be wrong. Right? That may not actually be what they're saying internally. But with all this, there's a big question, which was, what was the alternative to killing this guy? Right? A capture was not feasible. He was in a remote part of Yemen. A trial was, right, in the sense of he was invited back and said, you know, go ahead, come on back, we'll arrest you, we'll put you on trial. Right? And there was a judge who his father sued to get him off the kill list. And the judge said he's welcome to come back for trial. Right? So there was a case where the alternatives seemed to be lacking for a man who was posing a current and constant danger to American security. And this alternative question to me is a big one when you think about drones in general. All the alternative to drones are probably more troubling than drones themselves. If you think about drones versus airstrikes with fixed-wing aircraft, usually larger munitions, they kill a lot more people. Right? They're much less precise, they're more costly, and in some ways less versatile. Another alternative, let's say in Pakistan, would be to get the Pakistani army to go into tribal areas and do counterinsurgency. If you've studied Pakistani counterinsurgency practices, you know that often constitutes lining people up in the village and killing them, certainly driving people from their homes, a remarkable degree of brutality. If your goal is human rights, if your goal is to protect people, you don't want Pakistani counterinsurgency. Okay? So that's another alternative off the table. Another thing people mention is go after the long-term causes of terrorism. Okay? That's something that I think our head should nod when we say that, right? My problem as a scholar is actually I have no idea what those are. It's certainly not economic problems, right? In fact, if there is any correlation, it's that economic development produces more political violence if you're at poverty, right? At a certain point, you get so wealthy, you're fat and happy and relaxed. But if you're talking about lifting people out of poverty, it tends to make them more political and at times more willing to embrace violence. And if you think about that, there have been studies of terrorists, and they tend to be better educated than the population at large. And in general, this is not, to me, a very tough question, right? So if not economic, it's not education. So it might be fundamental political change in these countries. It's rather difficult to affect from the outside, right? It's not something that we can go and say, change your entire political system on our behalf. Excuse me, please. So, excuse me. So going after the long-term causes of terrorism, to me, is very difficult. So the real alternative people are saying is inaction, right? It's doing nothing. And at times, that might be appropriate, right? Not every terrorist around the world is an immediate threat to America. Going after everyone, to me, is prohibitive. And at times, doing nothing might be the right choice. But when you get to, in my view, senior terrorists, that's crazy, right? These are individuals who have tried to kill Americans and have shown a remarkable degree of competence in doing so. And so there's a question of where you draw that line in terms of who is a senior terrorist, how much you go after them. But to me, if there is an enemy out there actively plotting to kill you, it's not misguided, wrong, to be trying to stop them. However, if you think about this alternative question, think of it now in the context of the United States departing from Afghanistan, and also questions about Yemen, questions about Mali. In my view, if the US forces leave Afghanistan completely, not just a dramatic drawdown, it's not going to go back to how it was before 9/11, even if the Taliban win victory. And in part, it's because of things like the drone campaign, right? In order to avoid drones, they'll have to avoid large-scale training. They'll have to avoid having leadership congregate. It'll be much tougher for them to have the apparatus of a large terrorist group the way it was before than it was before 9/11. So it enables the United States in some ways to be less interventionist or to intervene on a less dramatic scale. Again, it gives options to the president. You can argue there's a danger we might become too involved. So maybe in, say, Mali, we'll do stuff that we wouldn't have done if the choice were only boots on the ground or not. But again, I think having some of that flexibility not necessarily does, but can make for a smarter foreign policy. So I think you could tell I'm a fan of the drone platform and in general the drone campaign. I think some of the criticisms are actually valid, but many of them are overstated, and few are plain wrong. And usually the alternatives are much worse. A lot depends, though, on your sense of threat, right? If you think there's really no danger anymore, then a lot of this seems exaggerated, I would say. If you think there's some danger, though, or considerable danger, to me it makes much more sense. A few very brief recommendations. An obvious one to me is, as you get into the signature strike realm, start to be very careful, right? Signatures themselves can be rather vague. The intelligence is almost always going to be imprecise. And so the risk of killing civilians goes up dramatically. And along with that, the moral and political consequences of doing so. I'm not against signature strikes, but I think it's something that you want a fairly high bar for, to only use in a few areas. And beyond that, you want what a signature is to be vetted very carefully. And the second, and this is, to me, a broader criticism of the Obama administration, is that you want rules to this campaign. Right? Drones are right now popular. The majority of Americans approve of the drone campaign, vast majority, in fact, and including attacks on Americans, although that figure is lower. The rules are starting to get out there in terms of statements there were several speeches by the Attorney General, by John Brennan when he was running the counterterrorism campaign. There are a number of very high-level people putting the rules out there. But I think it needs to be out there in a more comprehensive sense for a number of reasons. One is, you're going to have some high-profile failures over time. That's the nature of any program. And with that, people will start to ask questions, and you want to be able to say, these are the rules, we've agreed in a public sense on the rules, and here's why we should back them. I would say more broadly, it's necessary for a democratic society. Right? We are killing people, and we're killing, at times, once, Americans. It's perfectly reasonable to have the general parameters out there for when we will do this and when we will not do this. It's also something that, in my view, is appropriate as other countries start to do this. I think it's appropriate to say, here's a standard for the use of force in this context. And other countries actually should follow it. Right? It's the sort of thing where if we don't leave it out there, other countries will have their own interpretations, be much broader and much more dangerous in my view. So in a way, by being first and being aggressive, we can do a lot more in terms of setting the stage for what other countries will do in the future. So let me stop there as my voice gives out, and I would welcome your questions. Thank you. Sure, I can do it if you want, whatever's best.
Well, Dan, thanks for an incredibly lucid and thoughtful presentation. And now I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions, so why don't we start right here?
Thank you so much for your talk. So I'm actually writing my thesis on drones.
Well done.
Yeah. So this was perfect in a lot of ways. I really agreed with the fact, the last kind of argument you made in terms of the alternative is significantly worse. So what I'm actually examining was trying to compare drones to the alternative weapon systems and see if there's any major difference in American perceptions between them. I was wondering if you had any comment on that in terms of, you went through a lot of the arguments of drones in and of themselves being used against, as a counterterrorism weapon, and there's a lot of approval for that. But have you seen any kind of blowback in terms of the way that Americans perceive honor surrounding them? And I know that that's becoming major in terms of whether to award operators medals and things along those lines. I was wondering if you had any comments.
I can hook you up with some people, by the way, on that issue. Drones are certainly there. The question is about whether drones are seen by Americans in the context of other alternative approaches, and do they support them, but are there particular concerns related to drones beyond what you might expect, I would say. And one is any novel form of warfare incites concern, right? Forget the dates, but there was a while back when the Pentagon had this weapon that was going to cause massive blindness on the battlefield. Okay, which is, sounds god-awful, right? Thousands of blinded people. But remember, the alternative was to kill them, right? Was to, we use something called artillery, which we have for quite some time, and the goal is to put holes in people's bodies till they die, right? And that's perfectly fine, right? And yet the novelty of blindness meant they shut down the system, right? So at times, just novelty is part of it. There's something related to the unmanned aspect, I think, that makes it seem a bit scarier. And the idea of, a while back when we had elevators, the first elevators, you had human operators for them, right? And then when we switched over to the elevators we all know and love today that don't have humans, there were people who would not ride in them, right? Because there wasn't a human doing it, right? And we're getting to the point where if you board a commercial flight, it may soon be perfectly reasonable to have no pilot, right? To have the pilot be an operator on the ground. But it would kind of be weird, right? Would you be comfortable getting on a plane with no pilot, right? And it would kind of weird me out, right? Even though, that might be a better system. And so I think novelty is a big part of it. I think the non-human aspect is frightening and scary to people. Ironically, we think of humans as being able to check the kind of grimness of machines, right? Where machines might automatically respond, but humans are more likely to show restraint and be careful. Most experiments show the opposite, right? Which is, if I'm in combat and my buddy's just been killed and people in front of me surrender, I might kill them because I'm so angry and the bloodlust is on me, right? We have endless stories of this. A computer doesn't do that, right? A computer, the switch flicks and says, oh, we're now in a new situation of surrender. Everything changes. So again, I think it's people getting used to this. That's the big issue.
Wouldn't you agree, Dan, that one of the other things that make people uneasy is that whenever we have a new technology that sort of removes the actual the killing from human agency, or it seems to make it more remote, there's a sense that it makes killing easier and therefore less something people are doing with less seriousness. That's one of the senses I get from the debate anyway, much as we had a debate over strategic bombing.
I think that's absolutely right, that, again, it dehumanizes warfare. And as you alluded to, there is a debate within the military community over, do you give drone operators combat medals, right? It's a real question, right? Because the drones might be, for those of you who have been in combat zones, you might be in a place like Afghanistan, where you're there and you're technically in a combat zone, but there's American fast food, and you're in a very secure area, and in a way you might be safer than you are here in Hanover, right? Which is very different than being 2 miles away from there, facing the Taliban outside the wire, right? There are zones within and you can get a combat medal for being in the safe area, even though it's not particularly dangerous. So the question is, drone operators who might be saving people's lives, who might be very aggressive against the enemy, what sort of status do they have? And there's real questions about that, just the way there used to be real questions about, what do you deal with airmen who kill lots of people they don't even see, right? Who are bombing from 30,000 feet. What's their status in terms of combat? And again, the novel and the unknown and the mechanization, I think, cause issues with this.
Dan, you mentioned at the end other countries embarking on drone warfare, and there was the article recently about China's contemplation of this in Myanmar against a notoriously troublesome drug lord. So I wonder, can you give us kind of a sense of what other countries are in this business? And then with respect to China, I always drag you to Asia, sorry. But with respect to China, do we think that China would use this device in a similar way in terms of only in these kind of competent ally government settings, or in perhaps different ways?
This question of how other countries will respond as they develop their own drone programs, it's a huge one. And Ambassador Benjamin will be speaking on this in a week down in Washington. So I look forward to learning the truth. But with this in mind, a couple things. Israel was a pioneer in drone programs, and in part because Israel is exceptionally casualty sensitive. So the idea of having more aircraft that didn't involve dangers to pilots was appealing. And they used them largely as an adjunct to combat. So for surveillance was a big issue. And then in a way I would say was not dramatically different from the United States. But a number of countries are moving in this direction, in part because they're cheap, right? And aircraft are crazy expensive, right? So as countries around the world are slashing their military budgets, if you can get a lot of effectiveness from a relatively cheap platform, there's attraction to it. So I think we're moving in this direction. The question, again, would not be about a drone policy per se, but about an extraterritorial killing policy, right? And whatever the platform is. My sense is that I would say Russia in particular would view it differently, right? Russia has a history of kind of going out and killing people, right? Which they've done around the world, right? And this ranges from dissidents to what they would say would be terrorists. China, frankly, I just don't know enough about kind of their use of force strategies. But my sense is that the Chinese historically have been more cautious in terms of killing people outside China. So I think it's possible they could use drones just the way they might use an equivalent of a special forces raid if it's right along their border, because my sense is the Chinese see that as a legitimate sphere of military influence for their activities in most cases. But the country I would watch the most would be Russia.
So you mentioned that drones currently use pretty small munitions for sort of precision targeting. Do you see any scope going forward for maybe putting larger munitions on drones and using them in strategic efforts against, say, a country's electricity infrastructure or something that is, we've traditionally carried out in part of our offensive campaigns?
Sure. I mean, there's a debate in the Air Force community over whether we'll just be, in 25 years from now, we basically won't have manned aircraft, right? I mean, there's so much more you can do in terms of aircraft design if you don't have to keep a pilot alive, right? You can make things much more maneuverable. You can make things smaller, yet carry a larger payload. So I think we're moving in this direction. There'll be questions. The Air Force, of course, has a mystique of the pilot. And so there'll be a question of both that institutional and cultural mystique and a legitimate question that I'm not qualified to judge over, are there things a human pilot can do that you can't do with an array of sensors from the ground? My sense from pilots I know is that increasingly they fly by sensor, right? So it's the individual, the pilot is not looking out the window at the target, right? He or she is looking at an array of data coming in that could be, sitting here in the Dickey Center as well as being up in the air. So I think we're moving in that direction, and I'd be surprised if we don't get bigger platforms that have bigger payloads.
Okay, just for for the record, no one is operating a joystick in the Dickey Center.
Thank you. What is the U.S.'s brand strategy, and how does the drone program fit within it?
Grand strategy, like the whole world, or I have no idea. The more time you spend in Washington, the more skeptical you become about that. I tend to think the Obama administration's approach, I would say they have a couple of goals, right? One is they in general believe in being engaged in the world, but not with large-scale deployments of US troops. And so there's engagement, but drones fit in perfectly because it enables them to be involved in a variety of conflicts, to keep the lid on them, to at times tip the balance at relatively low cost. You can do limited air campaigns, as were done in Libya. But it's a relatively low-cost effort at foreign policy and military terms. In general, to me, it's a domestically focused administration. And so part of the goal is don't have foreign policy mess up domestic policy. In terms of the Middle East, which is where I focus most of my attention, Iran is obviously a priority. And drones beyond a surveillance role don't play a dramatic role in Iran policy. The administration is somewhat playing defense or reactively on the Arab Spring. I actually think that's understandable. It's a dramatic, overwhelming, somewhat unpredictable event. It varies a lot by country. And so the idea of having a comprehensive approach to it, to me, would probably be mistaken. So I think, in general, I don't think we have a grand strategy that's shaping all our actions. And even on a regional level, I think that's less true. Excuse me.
Hi. Recently, Senator Lindsey Graham reported that we've killed 4,700 people with drone strikes. But my question is, so Al-Qaeda is reported to be, Al-Qaeda's core membership is reported to be somewhere between 250 and 1,000 people. So, are we targeting people outside of Al-Qaeda with these drone attacks, or have there been that many sort of casualties?
Couple things. The Lindsey Graham figure, a lot of debate about that figure, I'll put it mildly, right? But broadly, a couple things on Al-Qaeda. One is it's an elite organization, right? So when it loses people, it replaces them from other organizations. But more broadly, a lot of what we're talking about is, the jargon is AQAM, right? Al-Qaeda and associated movements, right? So when you get to Al-Qaeda, the core, which is, I think, relatively small, you get to Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula, at a few thousand, Al-Qaeda of the Islamic Maghreb at a few thousand more, Shabab in Somalia, fighters who are going back and forth in Afghanistan, jihadists in Iraq, jihadists in Syria. You get a fairly broad group of folks, right? So you're talking lots of people, and add to that individuals who are involved, not necessarily with Al-Qaeda per se, in a narrow organizational sense, but more broadly in this jihadist current. You're talking a larger group. The problem with what I just said, though, is a lot of that larger group is not anti-American. Shouldn't say that. They hate the United States, but it's just not their priority, right? It's the sort of thing where they're focused on the government of Iraq, the government of Yemen, they're focused on fighting the French, whatever it is. And so there's a real question for US policy, which is, if we go after them, do we become priority number one, right? And I think their answer is sometimes, right? From a policymaker point of view, you're in real trouble, which is, in Yemen, you wait and you say, this is a Yemeni problem, not an American problem, and then they almost blow up a US airplane, right? But in other places, you say, well, if we go after them, why should we? They're focused on something else. Why should we support allies? But why should we make this a priority? So a lot of it comes down to this question of affiliates. How much of them are Al-Qaeda in a sense of matching priorities? And then within that, how high should they be on the list? Because we could, notionally at least, make the problem worse.
So you just, what you said, concerns about sort of the constitutionality of drone strikes, and also about maybe the publication of rules and standards. So I guess my question sort of has two parts. A, do you see this becoming a constitutional issue at any point, and maybe making it to the Supreme Court somehow? I don't know how that would be. And B, do you think there's any likelihood that rules and standards will actually get published by the Obama administration or some future administration?
In general, reaching the Supreme Court, my instinct is no. I followed the court rulings on these and related issues fairly closely, and the court, in general, is extremely reluctant to become involved in this, right? So Judge Bates, who gave an opinion, gave a fascinating opinion where he said, it's a little odd, right, where you need a warrant to wiretap a U.S. citizen, but not for this, right? You don't need the courts to weigh in when you're going to kill someone, right? That's a little strange, right? But his ruling was courts have no business in this one, right? He raises about 10 provocative questions and then says, not our issue. And in general, the courts are reluctant to get involved in classic national security issues because they claim, I think rightly, they don't have the expertise, right? The question of who is a combatant, what are the appropriate procedures is not something that is seen as a traditional area of legal expertise. So I would say, given that we've been doing this for 12 years and it hasn't gone up, I think unlikely, but not out of the question. I do think, I hope it's the Obama administration, but I do think an administration may make the rules even clearer. In part, my understanding is part of the reason the Obama administration began to make a lot of statements about the campaign before the election was they thought there was a chance they might lose. Right? And as a result, they wanted to, most administrations, Democrat or Republican, have a view which is, well, we know what we're doing, but we're worried that the next guys won't, right? Because whoever they are, they're a bunch of idiots, right? So as a result, we want to lock things in. So part of what they were doing was putting out rules in order to make it harder for the next administration to change things, right? They didn't want to say, here's a blank slate, have fun. And so I think that logic, that political logic will be there for future administrations as well, including the second Obama administration. And in general, again, I think there's a logic to this both in terms of basic democracy, but also in terms of the sustainability of the program. You want this out, you want some sense of public buy-in and consensus because it makes the program more sustainable over time.
Thank you. Related to legality and rules, in terms of not domestic law, but international law, laws of war, international human rights law, are there any matters that are legal matters or issues that are unsettled in your own mind? And kind of the question next to that is, do you think there's oversight and constraints that aren't in place that should be in place to avoid these?
I have to be careful again since I'm not a lawyer. Okay, so whether I think there are disagreements or problems is almost meaningless, right? Because I don't claim expertise. Certainly, there are big disagreements in international law over this. One huge question is what constitutes a combatant, right? Is there a question of, does a 19-year-old young man with a gun in a war zone constitute a combatant? Next step of this question of imminence, right? A number of human rights organizations, including the International Committee of the Red Cross, their view of imminence is, I have a gun and I'm going to shoot someone. That's imminent. But if I'm hanging out plotting, that's not imminent, right? That's a very different view and has huge implications for what the Obama administration is saying. So to me, those are ones I know about. I suspect there are a dozen big others I don't know about or haven't registered. In terms of oversight, there's no oversight, right? I mean, congressional oversight is something that is lacking in most substantive domestic issues and is even weaker on foreign policy issues. Part of this is the classified nature of the program. And a lot of oversight in America comes from the American people, right? So if all of a sudden the Social Security Administration stops issuing checks, we'll have oversight because millions of Americans will scream, right? There's no national security equivalent to that, right? So it relies on people in the system to identify problems, and that's difficult for the people in the system. It's difficult for the system to correct itself. Within Congress, there historically has not been much interest in intelligence. I served on intelligence committees. It's just not, in general in Congress, interest comes from a number of things, right? One is, can I bring home bacon to my constituents, right? A. B, can I get lots of money for re-election? So, banking, right? So I get PAC money, right? C, can I make a name for myself? So Judiciary Committee, which doesn't have bacon and doesn't have constituents, gets good people because during a Supreme Court hearing, you can be a statesman and you can ask profound questions, right? With the intelligence committees, you get none of that, right? Because it's behind closed doors. So you don't get any of the constituent advantages and you don't get the political advantages. So historically, people don't pay much attention to intelligence, and it's confusing. It's confusing to people within the system. So to me, there's just not much oversight on these issues. And there was a fascinating series, I'm going to say 2 years ago, maybe longer, by Donna Priest, a Washington Post reporter, and Bill Arkin on Top Secret America. And it was this massive series based on a book. And it wasn't about, grand conspiracy of the secret world. It was just, this thing is huge and no one within it understands it, let alone the people outside it, right? And frankly, as someone who works with government in a variety of ways, I felt pretty smug about my knowledge of this. And I read that and thought, I don't know any of this stuff, And so to me, oversight is lacking on a public level and on a congressional level. And I don't have a good way to fix it.
I'm shocked, Dan, shocked by your
The whole drone warfare is a major statement of the advance of technology that we've had, and I generally agree with your points here. Technology can cut both ways, and I was wondering if you had any, from your knowledge of the area, if you had knowledge of anti-drone, shoulder operated anti-drone material that could be developed by, I don't know, North Korea or people like that.
Drones are actually not particularly hard to shoot down, right? They're small, right? So they're difficult in that sense compared to a much larger aircraft. They're harder, but they go slow, right? And there are, reportedly, I have no knowledge other than what I saw on television, the drone shot down over Iran was a stealth drone, right? So there is some stealth capability. I have no idea if that's true, but that was some of the reports I saw. Some are harder than others, but certainly these things can be shot down. But again, go back to cheap, right? This is where in the last 30 years or so, we've gotten used to thinking of aircraft as almost irreplaceable. Where an aircraft was shot down, that's a huge loss, right? That's not a historic view of aircraft, right? We lost many in many of our wars. And I think drones will go back to that older view where, we were fighting a war. Today we lost 8 drones. It's too bad. But, the pilots lived and the drones themselves are replaceable.
But could anti-drone weaponry shoot down not just 8, but 18 or 25 in a day? Like
Inevitably, on these things, it's a back and forth, right? So you have a new weapon that is capable of defeating the current defense systems. Then you get electronic countermeasures. You get increased stealth. You get all these things that reduce that danger. Then there are new mechanisms. I anticipate, without particular expertise, that it'd be similar to the same things that have happened with fixed-wing aircraft, where you've had back and forth between defenders on the ground and the pilots in the aircraft.
Do you think that the U.S. drone policy has any impact on America's ability to work with the Muslim world in achieving, say, Israeli policy in peace or in stopping a nuclear Iran?
In drone policy or kind of overall policy?
Specifically the drone policy.
I think the drone policy, it's been, I'll say, frankly irrelevant. The people who don't like the United States in the region, this is just one more reason not to like them. But it's not particularly high on their list. There are about 20 reasons why an Israeli-Palestinian peace is not moving forward. I actually would not put drones on that list. In terms of Iran, I think it's not why Iran is getting a nuclear weapon. I will say, in a small way, one reason Iran wants a nuclear weapon is the United States has conventional military superiority, and nuclear weapons can offset this. Drones are part of conventional military superiority, so that is true. But if you took drones away, the U.S. would still have conventional military superiority in a dozen ways as well. So I see it as small. Please.
Sorry, just to clarify, does it impact the Muslim world's public image of the U.S., which would then influence the policy in those countries?
Civilian casualties do, right? So when the United States blows up the wrong thing, yes. And there's again this conflation of drones and fixed-wing aircraft. So in a number of cases, the United States has killed significant numbers of innocent people. And those are more likely to have been fixed-wing aircraft, much more likely, in fact. And those are often conflated with drones, just like Abu Ghraib is conflated with Guantanamo frequently, where people talk about abuses at one when it's really something happening at the other. So I think that issue is, I think in general there is a sense of the United States throwing its weight around, which drones are part of, in part because the governments we work with often are claiming not to work with us. So it looks like we're, rather than helping Yemen, we're abusing Yemen. So I think that would play in as well. Those are problems we already have that are magnified slightly by drones, I'd say.
Slightly beside the point, but of all the many countries that are lined up to buy American drones, 2 of the most insistent are from the Muslim world. I wouldn't specify that.
So 2 questions. So let's say we agree with everything you said. And
Which how would you do? So go ahead.
Yeah, totally. And we agree that drones are really valuable. From your perspective, like, do we have close to the proper number of drones now? Or if we were trying to do everything that you're talking about, should we have twice as many, 3 times as many, 10 times as many? So I'm just trying to figure out like where we are. In part to ask the question of like, why for some of these missions, if they do have greater risk of collateral damage with aircraft, why are we using aircraft? So not enough drones? That's the first question. And the second question concerns the range of drones, like how far they can go, and in the future, how far they likely are to be able to go. Because here I'm wondering about, let's say again, we also agree that in Pakistan and Afghanistan that it's a very effective tool. What I'm trying to figure out is, now or in the future, do we actually have to have drones be based in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, or can be based further away in countries for which basing them in that country might be less controversial?
Okay. The proper number of drones. Drones are used extensively in combat zones, right? So we use them tremendously in Iraq. We use them incredible numbers in Afghanistan in support of U.S. troops. And as the United States has withdrawn from Iraq and is withdrawing from Afghanistan, actually we're going to free up a lot of our arsenal. In some ways, people are worried about that because to take a very different case, which is the Special Operations Force community. Right? You have a bunch of people who are very well trained, very good at something, who are, I don't want to say unemployed, but don't have a focus the way they did in Afghanistan. So the question is, will they look for a mission? And will we become involved perhaps in other places? So with drones, I actually think we'll have some capacity freed up. My instinct again and again is we'll be moving towards this across the platform range. So I think we'll be producing more. A bigger issue in some ways is the human capacity to exploit what drones do. Right? If you think about one drone as having a continuous video feed and picking up communications and so on, that's useless information unless someone looks at the information. Right? For those of you who follow the National Security Agency, which intercepts electronic communications, right? They, according to press reports, suck up vast amounts of information, right? Just stunning. And they have an interesting legal argument, which is they're not spying on someone until someone looks at that, right? So it's the equivalent of, I just copied your hard drive, but I'm not spying on you until I actually start to look at what's on your hard drive. And their point, though, is, look, we don't have remotely the human capacity to look at all this stuff, right? So we can only look at a small part of it. I think that's actually the weakness in the expansion of the program, is you want large numbers of good people. And I think we're still learning how to do this. We're not bad at it, but we're still learning how to integrate a lot of the new information we're getting from this into broader things. As you know, right now the range for most drones is relatively short range. And part of it is we want a large amount of loiter time, right? We want to use a lot of the limited fuel and so on just to stay above the target as long as possible. So shorter range is better. You certainly could extend the range, right? There are technical ways to do that. It's more costly, but technical ways, and you have less loiter time. If you base in neighboring countries, it changes the political dynamics, right? The question would be, if you're basing in a neighboring country, but you're flying to, let's say you're based in, you want to do operations in Pakistan, but you're basing yourself in Afghanistan. Does Pakistan still want you there? Right? It's different if they don't want you there. That's what would change the political calculus much more, I think, than where the base is.
I guess this is going off of that question to some extent. You had mentioned when you were talking about cons, the idea of allied governments. This program happens with allied governments, and the argument that they are uncomfortable is belied by the fact that they allow the program to go on. Is that?
Yeah, I would say they are uncomfortable, which is in the sense of they do criticize it as a way of giving themselves insurance against their own people. But they're part of this process, right? It's not like they're it's not being done against their will, is how I would put it.
And I guess the question that I have is there a sense that the governments themselves, or in a democracy, let's say, or whatever, however we qualify Pakistan, is there a threat of destabilizing a government so that an out-of-power party, let's say, or group might look at the people that are, in fact, supporting the drone program as co-opted by the United States? You know, is that part of the cost analysis?
Yes, it should be. I don't know if it is, but it should be. This gets to the unpopularity of the United States in general among the populaces of these countries. So whether it's cooperating with the drone program or any other form of cooperation, especially military cooperation, it delegitimates the government somewhat. Again, I think these governments have much bigger problems than cooperation with the United States. That's the fundamental sources of their legitimacy problems. But a small difference can be quite big in terms of the overall impact. So I think that should be, I think at times it is a concern. There's been a State Department complaint, which is at times they'll say, it's a sensitive time in fill-in country here in Pakistan, keep things calm, yet the drone program kind of continues without their input. I would like to see more, I'll say State Department for lack of a better institutional source, State Department input into that question. But I would say that's a relatively small part of the equation, but still part of the equation.
Sound man, that fine. More questions?
Hi. I feel you gave a very balanced perspective of the pros and cons of drones, but I do feel that the cost-benefit analysis you gave is from a very U.S. perspective, which is understandable because the U.S. wants to win the war. However, I feel that a lot of other countries, not just the countries that the drones are attacking, feel that there's something instinctively wrong with drones as a weapon. And even Americans feel that there's something instinctively morally wrong about it. So my question is that, and this might be a bit idealistic, do you feel, so I have two questions. Do you feel that maybe we're compromising something in terms of our stance? I mean, the reason we feel morally instinctively against terrorism is because it attacks civilians. And it could be the same could be said about drones. Do you feel we might be compromising something in terms of our moral stance with drones? My second question is, do you feel that maybe in 50, 100 years' time that other countries might be using drones against the U.S.?
I think to answer the second question first, certainly if you accept my belief that we're going to see more mechanization of air warfare, countries that attack the United States via air or ground for that matter are likely to use unmanned platforms. And that's going to grow over time. So I think yes, but to me that will happen regardless of U.S. policy. There's just a lot that can be done with this, right, without trying to predict too much. The other question of, does it hurt the U.S. moral stance, moral position? I would say it's not the drones per se. It's the question of the perceived killing of innocents, right? And that's something that I think the United States has done actually a remarkably bad job of trying to get its message out about who's being killed. And the answer, I don't know, because it's very hard. These are happening in remote areas. And there is this issue of who's a combatant. But the anti-drone, I would say, community has been much better at saying there are large numbers of civilians dying from this, much more effective than the pro-drone community, which has been, to me, just rather smug and saying, oh, it's not a big problem, don't worry about it. And I do think it actually, wrongly, but nevertheless, in reality, risks damaging U.S. moral credibility. But it's less the platform and more the question of the willingness to allow the deaths of innocents. And I think, again, publicizing procedures, explaining what steps are taken to avoid that, going through steps and saying, here are cases where individuals were seen as innocent, but in fact they were not. And at times actually being transparent about when you do kill innocents, right? I mean, that's part of warfare. It's not something that every time, if you have a 99% success rate, you'll still kill a fair number of innocents, actually. And saying, here are our standards. And part of that is more broadly engaging the human rights community, right? Some of them will criticize no matter what, but others will recognize that if they can move the military in this direction, it's a positive thing. And they can be credible spokesmen. And that's in part because there are a number of the human rights folks I talk to have actually tried to be a bit more modulated on this issue because they recognize steps being taken to ensure precision and to reduce civilian casualties, and they don't want to push too hard against that.
Can I try a hypothesis out on you? Part of the reason that people are uncomfortable about this program is that when drones are operating in zones of armed conflict, in Afghanistan, for example, no one asks any questions. But the notion of being at war with a group that doesn't actually have a state is much more problematic for people. And even though under the authorization to use military force, we are effectively at war with a group, the use of violence in these other areas makes people very uneasy, and they want to see this explained either in a criminal justice paradigm or in some other paradigm, in some other way that hasn't been fully elaborated yet.
I think that's right. And there's in today's kind of media environment, if you don't tell your story, someone else will tell it for you, right? And I think we will sit back and say it's fine not telling our story as effectively as we could.
I have a question about sort of the deniability of drone strikes. We don't publicly, we don't confirm drone strikes, but with the proliferation of drone strikes to other drone capabilities to other states, would it be necessary then to sort of take responsibility for strikes to avoid confusion over the sources? Could that lead to potential conflicts?
I haven't thought about this, so you're getting my.
But I mean, it's just so it's a deniable sort of strike at this point. It's not.
Well,
except that it's only the United States that has a technology right now.
Well, others are there or getting there, and it's deniable by policy, right? I mean, you could have a deniable F-16 strike, right? You could have a deniable special forces raid. So it's a question in some ways of do you want less deniability in general? And I think, I mean, I'm going to give you a worthless answer. I think at times yes, at times no, right? Where there'll be times where we'll very much want to preserve either confusion about who did something or secrecy. But at other times, we'll either want to make it clear it was us, not them, or vice versa. So I think the option of having it be clandestine will be something future administrations would want to preserve.
So, here's a hand that hasn't been up before.
What interests me in this is the historical background of drones. And I would look at the Germans with their V2 bombs just as nerve-wracking in those days as these drones are now. Now those V2 bombs went from Germany to England, that was it. And after the war, they seemed to have petered out in terms of popularity. We didn't use them in Korea or blah, blah, blah. So what does this all mean in terms of mechanisms of actually using these kinds of weapons? Because we're using them now. Does this mean that forever and ever we will be blamed for it? And or will it be a situation as with the Germans? Nobody mentions it anymore. Nobody remembers practically that these V2 bombs were sent over and did this tremendous destruction in England.
I don't think most people have particularly long memories, in the sense of if 50 years from now, if there is a war between India and China that involves extensive uses of drones, people are going to go back and say, well, it's really America's fault because they did that. Well, just like when there were huge questions about ballistic missiles and cruise missile technologies and their proliferation and their use, people aren't going back and saying, well, you know, it really is the Germans' fault with the V2. So I think that the technology will exist independently of the creator and be used and seen as being used in the future without an American stamp on it. What's different, though, will be how it's used, right? And people still talk about, you know, the use of nuclear weapons, or for that matter, conventional weapons, against civilian populations in World War II. And that's less to me the platform and more about the overall policy where the goal was to kill civilians. And so I think people will remember how the United States used force and use it either to justify or to criticize future uses of force.
Do you think there's a chance that we're approaching a more close
world with less diplomacy because of drones, because it's so easy to obtain intelligence through drones that will just cease the normal operations of human intelligence in some parts of diplomacy?
No, in part because, again, the drone campaign is really an adjunct to cooperation with allies, right? So there's a lot of diplomacy, often unsuccessful, that goes back and forth between the United States and Pakistan on counterinsurgency issues, on going after these. So in part because drones work with allies rather than against them, I think that diplomacy in some ways becomes more important. There is a problem, which is, and Ambassador Benjamin can speak to us more than I, which is the atrophying of the State Department, right? Which is, if you just compare budgets, the State Department is a rounding error in the military budget, right? I mean, it is, right? It's just, which is staggering. And one of the constituencies that complains about this the most is actually the military community, where they say we're being thrown into these situations where we don't do this, right? We don't do diplomacy. It's not why you call on us. It's not where our skill set is, and so on. And more broadly, it's because that's where the money is, right? If you're a foreign leader, you want to work with DOD, you want to work with other government agencies because they have money and the State Department doesn't. They can't help you as much. So to me, that's the bigger danger is of militarization, is not because of these systems per se, but rather just our funding structure within the United States.
There's a lot of truth to that. If I understood your question, part of it was, is this glut of intelligence going to make it unnecessary for us to do? No. Diplomacy is never going to go away because of an excess of intelligence, because all the intelligence you have still adds up to an impartial and a very fragmented mosaic. So, and most of what's being gathered by these devices anyway is battlefield.
Could it hurt diplomacy, do you think, like in the case of Iran, that it's easier to fly a drone over their nuclear plants than talking to them?
I mean,
would rather do that.
It could, in the sense of, you can always choose not to use diplomacy, right? But the vast majority of uses of force also involve uses of diplomacy. I mean, there's a massive worldwide diplomatic effort on Iran, massive. I mean, it's arguably the dominant Obama administration concern in the last 5 years is that diplomatic coalition against Iran. It's working with the Iranians to get them to change. So they could jettison that, but that wouldn't be, to me, due to the drones per se, but just rather a broader policy decision to avoid this.
I would also just add that Secretary Gates used to often bemoan the underfunding of the State Department, and Secretary Gates is a great man. However, he was never really willing to write that check to the State Department that would have made the big difference. That clock is 5 minutes slow by my watch, so I would recommend we gather 2 or 3 questions and let you deal with it in rapid order. Yes?
Yes, following on the other question I was asking before, the idea that the drone campaign requires a U.S. military footprint on the ground, say in Pakistan. And I don't know enough about the policy, but is that the only American military footprint on the ground? And is there a con aspect to that the drone actually puts some aspect of the American military in Pakistan or in Yemen, which otherwise wouldn't be necessary?
I'm sorry, we're gathering a few questions.
Oh, okay. So my question is, you mentioned that there is a growing tendency to rely more on drones and other unmanned platforms. Do you think this will kind of allow future administrations the leeway / the incentive to kind of phase out other kinds of conventional capabilities, or do you think this will grow as a separate program on top of existing conventional capabilities? Because there is a lot of gripe over, defense budget and whatnot, and I was wondering if you could see this as an alternative to keeping the expensive conventional capabilities.
And that would be it. Yeah. Great. So drones, the Air Force conducted a study in which drone operators have higher PTSD rates than, which you're probably familiar with. But that's compared to other kind of logistical support. So I was wondering if there's any sort of study that's been conducted between drone operators and pilots, or drone operators and like ground troops, and kind of how PTSD relates.
Last one, I don't know. So easy answer. The question of other U.S. presence on the ground. Often, again, this is part of supporting local counterinsurgency efforts. And the United States has a presence frequently in terms of helping arm, train allied militaries to fight counterinsurgency. And more broadly, the intelligence apparatus designed to support that. So it varies by country and time and so on. But drones are often part of a broader effort. But this is seen in many ways as a very deliberate alternative to US forces. Right? So ironically, it's one of these, we deploy US forces to avoid deploying US forces. Right? Where it's saying, we're going to help the allies. And here's what it takes, and it involves some Americans. But that means we actually don't have to go in a big footprint way ourselves. Will it phase out other capacities? It should. Right? Just because it gives you certain capabilities that are cheaper and better than other systems. The military for the last 12 years has had money rain down upon it, right? And when money rains down, you don't have to make hard choices. That's going to change, right? We're seeing that with sequester already, but there are going to be some very difficult issues, and at times, in my view, the wrong systems will win. A lot depends on what threat you're planning against, right? Drones can't do everything, and certainly right now they're very limited. But I think that as their capabilities develop, I think we'll see them more and more in place of other systems, or at least in place of significant numbers of other systems. So there might be a limited number of very good manned air-to-air fighters, but drones will play a greater role than they have historically as time goes on.
Okay, well, Professor Byman, thank you very much for a terrific presentation and a really, really thoughtful, comprehensive view of the subject. I don't want to halt the applause.
Thank you.